I keep a close watch on this heart of mine. I keep my eyes wide open all the time. I keep the ends out for the tie that binds. Because you're mine, I'll walk the line.
I'm Professor of Internet Studies at the Oxford Internet Institute, but I'm a professorial fellow at Balliol College, and it's really a pleasure to welcome you to Balliol College to hear the Oliver Smithies Lecture and Fellow, Christine Borgman. She's going to be speaking on scholarship in the networked world, and of course she's written extensively on this over the years while she's been at UCLA as the, most recently, the presidential professor of information studies at UCLA. But she's here as the Oliver Smithies Lecturer and also is an affiliation with the Oxford Internet Institute, which revisits a former stay that Christine made here earlier, and then also the Oxford E-Research Center. And while she has been here, she has been working on the digital scholarship lecture series with me and Sarah Thomas, the Bodleian librarian. And this is not really part of that lecture series in a formal sense, but it's sort of a capstone of that, and it ends a series of lectures she's done on scholarship in the digital age. And any of you at Balliol, you will have known Christine. We all are worried and thinking all the time about how we treat our, how we do what we do as scholars. What we do with our data, how we publish, where we publish, whether it's open or closed, and proprietary journals or open science. And so we all, in a sense, have dealt with these issues, but Christine tries to understand this across the disciplines. So we know that every discipline has somewhat different practices, and she's trying to make sense of these practices across the disciplines. If you're a fellow at Balliol and if you've gone to lunch or dinner, you've probably been quizzed by Christine Borgman about what are you doing with your data, and do you even have any data? Apparently, there's no data in this world as well as little data and big data. So anyway, we're really happy to welcome you here. And I must say, as one of the fellows at Balliol, I've never seen a visiting fellow jump in both feet with really becoming such a element in the college for the last year. You've really made the most of it and to all the benefit of the college. But anyway, let's welcome Christine for her final lecture. Okay?
Thank you. Thanks, Bill. And thanks to Dave DeRohr, the head of the E-Research Center, who's here as well, and to all the wonderful colleagues from Balliol, and many of those of you are beyond Balliol and the Bodleian. This has been the most incredibly generative place to write a book on the changing nature of scholarship. And as Bill said, I indeed have been having these conversations with people, and asking people about their data is a very good conversation starter around Oxford. And I hope that some of those conversations you will hear in this lecture and in this book, which is well underway. So let's just start at the top. This is a chart that we made for the National Science Foundation Task Force on Cyber Learning about 5 years ago, and it turns out to be very useful to think about the way in which communication has changed and become much more mediated over the centuries. But this is a cumulative chart. We are still certainly working face to face, which is why we've come together in this room to have a conversation. And at the same time, we've gone even beyond the networked world, all the way out here to the cyber infrastructure mediated world, where we're concerned about cloud storage, about international distributed networks of people, tools and resources that we move around. So the way we conduct our scholarship has moved more and more online, while at the same time people still valuing the physical and the local and the conversations. The particular part of this transition that I'm concerned about is this shift from thinking about scholarship as books, as paper, as physical forms of communication to thinking of it as data and as small units to be disaggregated, reaggregated, mined, and used in very different ways. The trend is the largest and fastest in the sciences, as is often the case as far as where the investments are made, but it is happening across all of the disciplines. If you look at the social sciences, we've seen that people are less and less willing to answer surveys or to answer their phone, for that matter. So we've moved toward things like using Twitter feeds as ways to look at social trends. And you get a much different kind of mapping. If you look into the humanities, there's a real resurgence of the building of digital collections, and these digital tools and services are seen as a way to revitalize parts of the humanities and use them as new forms of argument, new media, and taking advantage of tools that previously were only available in the sciences. There's a certain amount of bottom up, but there's also quite a bit of top down. This is just a sampling of the kinds of policies that are being promulgated, whereas you're being asked to publish anything from publicly funded research in open access journals. That's been underway for a while in the US, and in Britain it's now becoming it'll be much more heavily enforced with these new rules from the RCUK. And coupled with most of these is requirements that you make your data available. If you have public funding to do your research, making the data available is being seen as part of it. And not just for the sciences. This covers everyone. That is, the social sciences, the humanities. If you get any kind of funding, you're going to find yourself under some of these new rules. Australia is moving even faster. They built a very large national network. What I've been trying to do, and had the peace and time to do here at Balliol and OII and the Research Center, is to try to articulate this whole big mess into the elevator speech. Sort of what's the problem statement? What's really going on here? And this is about as narrow and focused as I've been able to get it so far, is to say we're moving towards scholarship being conducted in the open, as opposed to working quietly in your labs, quietly in your libraries for several years before you began to publish. Now so much of what you do from beginning to end is conducted online. So what are the opportunities and the challenges in this environment? How do you value these many different kinds of scholarly records that are being created? Which ones should we keep? Which ones should we give people credit for? You know, the books and journals, yes, but what else? How should they be kept, and by whom? Should researchers be expected to keep their own data and release it on demand? Should the libraries be keeping it? Should each community be developing its own data archive for the end of the grant? Should it be kept forever? Should it be kept as long as the materials are being kept in the Bodleian Library? What are reasonable expectations, and what are reasonable expectations for people to be able to get back to that content at some future time? So the answers that we come up with to these kinds of questions will determine what is available for the next generation of scholars, because those tweets are going away. In some areas, we may be going into a digital dark age. That's a concern if we don't make some decisions and make them soon. I'm also looking at how these concerns vary by academic field, because these policies that you see coming down from RCUK, from the White House, are fairly generic to apply to everybody. But research is conducted so differently from field to field that they do not play out the same way. This is what the book looks like so far. It's about 2/3 written. Had a lot of quiet time here. The first section is framing the issues around data and scholarship. It's taken me an entire 40-page chapter to explicate what are data. The middle part is 6 case studies, 2 each in the sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. And then the last part pulls together the data policy and the practice issues, the credit issues, and the funding agency, the publisher issues, and so on. Now, a talk that takes you seriatim through the 10 chapters of a book is a really boring talk. I'm not going to do that to you. But I want to show you that I do have the detail as I fly high and try to give a big arc and give you examples from a number of different disciplines. So if you come up with an exception to something, I probably have thought about it and have an answer for it, but there's, I'll be somewhat generic in trying to work across. So what I'm going to spend the time doing is to talk through these 4 different sort of theories and themes that are what tie the different parts of the book together. My first claim is that open scholarship is an idea that goes back centuries, and that notion is still there, but it's being manifested in very, very different ways in this environment than it was decades and centuries ago. The second is that the formal part of communication, the publication process, is converging with the informal, the talks, the activities, what would have been the water cooler conversations, as more and more of it is being conducted online. And that gives us opportunities to rethink the way we do scholarship, but also poses some very difficult challenges. Okay. The third is that the data practices are local, that these global policies and directives are very hard to implement, and it's going to mean a lot of rethinking about how universities are run, how publishing is done, how funding agencies allocate their resources. All of which leads up to this last point, that open access to data is a fairly fundamental shift in the way that we do scholarship. The degree to which it's a paradigm shift is different from field to field, but it's not just a simple transition from the way that we've been doing scholarship before. Is there anyone who has not seen an image of the first issue of the Transactions of the Royal Society at some point? 1665, this is considered to be the first English language journal. It's often given as the marker for the beginning of open science. Prior to this time, science was documented by letters between learned gentlemen, and they were mostly gentlemen. With the beginning of the journal publication, it was then in the open, and this was the beginning of peer review. This said it's not scholarship until you let other people read it and criticize it, and people can discuss it. We can take it back even further. And Stefano Ziccotti kindly pointed me to this piece that's sitting over in the Ashmolean, a few blocks from here. It's enough to put on paper. You can carve it in brick and it will last even longer. And these were found apparently in looking for building materials. This is an old Buddhist sutra, and it was a way of carving it up, setting it down, disseminating it, and having it last for a very, very long time. Okay. So how do we disseminate the scholarship? We can put it, actually this is the Royal Transactions is still a continuing journal. You can put it in a traditional journal like Science. You can put it in a completely open access journal like the Public Library of Science. This is PLOS 1, which is now one of the highest impact and fastest growing journals, publishes a very large chunk of modern English language science. Or you can put it in the new Open Library for the Humanities, which is just beginning to launch as a model specifically on the Public Library of Science. You can disseminate prior to publication in areas like astronomy and physics, parts of mathematics and computer science. You would put your manuscript into archive as soon as you submit it for journal publication, because you want it out, you want it read. By the time it appears in the journal, it's old news. You're speeding up the cycle of people having access to the material. You can put it in the Social Sciences Research Network if you're in the social sciences, and of course you can put it right here in the Oxford Research Archive, no matter what the discipline is. Whole collaborations are building up around these mechanisms to share resources. Z-fin for the zebrafish, this is one particularly important one. And notice that it's not just the data, it also has a wiki, protocols, antibodies, jobs, meetings, news groups, people, labs, companies that you can work for as part of all of this. And the ones that are the most successful are the ones that really do have communities around them. Flybase, there's tens of thousands of people who work on Drosophila, and they work around this as a common shared database and international community. One of the reasons that these communities work well is that they've also agreed on ontologies. They've agreed on ways to structure their data and what the relationships are between particular kinds of data. And this allows people to merge and converge and find things again in ways that don't work nearly as well in some other fields. But that's not to say it's only happening in the sciences. This is the International Dunhuang Project. Dunhuang is the caves at the end of the Silk Road where 50,000 paper documents were found early in the 20th century, dating about 1,000 years earlier. They're considered some of the earliest written documents. The British Library, among many others, got in quickly and took most of them away. Very few of them relatively remain in Chinese hands. And this was long before the current treaties on repatriation. So these things are being repatriated digitally. And notice that we've got the major institutions, the British Museum, the Victorian Albert Museum, Asian Art, and others participating, and then it's being translated into many different languages. Okay. So this is a valuable resource. The humanities community, actually humanities and social sciences, particularly so the qualitative end of the humanities, has whole, again, communities built around resources that would be fairly similar to the kind of community services you would see around the science databases. You've got less progress on the ontologies in the humanities, but a fair amount. And here you've got, this is a museum model where they have built different tools and ontologies to agree upon how you mark up digital objects. So open scholarship is the norm. You can put almost anything out right now. Who's used Figshare so far? 2 people in the back row, that's all. Wow, okay. Figshare is one of the fastest growing resources. You can put almost anything in it. You can put the figures and slides from your presentations. It will put a digital object identifier on it. And here it says you can make it discoverable, shareable, citable. You can put your social science data here. You can put almost anything in Dataverse. You can get a marker for it. You can get back to it. And if you're at Harvard, they will promise to keep it. Okay. But you can set up your own Dataverse almost anywhere. So again, what's happening is we're getting more open, but it's sort of spiraling outward into openness. When you say, let's release the data, releasing the data alone rarely makes sense. You usually need the software, the scripts, the code, the methods that go with it to be able to use it later. The arguments for this are many. The strongest one is that it begets rigor. Okay. So just like the early arguments for peer review are that if you have to conduct your work completely in the open, you're going to conduct it to a higher standard. And David Schotten, Dave Dror, and others were at this meeting in late April conducted here, just called Openness and Rigor in Science, to sort of push this model. Great concerns about fraud. You work in the open, people can inspect your work, less fraud. Arguments that it speeds the pace of research, the kind of structural genomics that Panos is working on. This is a very important part of the argument. But there's also concerns that you're going to get free riders. You know, Ashley got the grant, and Carol got the data, and decide to do something else with it later. So what's happening? Who gets to take advantage of these different kinds of materials? This is usually handled by a process of embargoes where if you get the grant, you get to keep the control of the data for anywhere from, say, 6 months to 5 years before you have to release it. So open access doesn't usually mean you have to let it out immediately, but if you're holding on it for 5 years, it's hard to argue that you're speeding up the pace of research. Okay. Many people say they won't release their data because they're concerned that people will misuse it, misinterpret it, attribute something to me that I didn't really say, didn't really mean. That might be because the resources weren't well enough documented, but it might also mean that the people trying to reuse the data didn't really know what questions to ask and were making inappropriate assumptions about it. And when you start to move data across disciplinary lines and reuse things for purposes they were not meant, that becomes a problem quickly. That's part of the big data argument where people are saying, oh, it's all we need is correlation, we don't need to worry about causation anymore. You've got big issues of cleaning the data and figuring out really what went on in there, what were the assumptions that were made. Okay. Sharing human subjects data is a really hard problem. Often it simply can't be done, or with degrees of anonymity, anonymization that are done in the medical world but are not so well known in others. This is a really sticky wicket here on the conflicting policies. Promised you some legal points. Okay? That your university might say you have to destroy the data at the end of the project. Your funding agency might say you have to release it and make it available. Your publisher may say it needs to go in a supplemental materials. Your research partners might say, I'm under another legal jurisdiction, I don't need to do what you have to do. And this list goes on. And these are really unresolved conflicts. Okay. And then you get this, I don't do data. And you find this not only in the humanities, but periodically we find it in astronomy. And cosmology, most often of, I build models, I don't do data, and yet the models they build are very reliant on other people's data, and then they will consider the output of their simulations to be data. But people in pretty much any field are using some form of evidence, some form of records that can be treated as data and do fall under these guidelines. Okay, so that was the openness side of it. The second one is this convergence. Okay. In my world, this is a very famous chart. Okay. Dave, you've seen this before. I'm not sure anybody else. Anybody else seen this before? Okay. It appeared in Science in 1964 by Garvey and Griffith. Don't try to read the fine print. It's the gray part versus the white part that's important. This is how scientific information was disseminated in psychology in the 1960s. This was sort of the whole growth of the scientific and technical investment in the sort of Sputnik days. And what they found was there's a timeline over here on the left of a lag of about 36 months from the beginning of the project to the point of a journal article. And in that 3-year period, things were communicated with seminars, small audiences, conference papers, and then a bit of trickle out thereafter. But this whole process culminates in this box in the middle which says journal article. Okay. So here the theory is you do all this work, but the journal article is the product. That's the piece that you're concerned about. Now, how do you give credit for scholarship in that environment? Certainly you should look at the content, but in fact, we have these metrics where you're counting the citations to the journal or the citations to the individual article, and that's where we get things like impact factors, H-index. If you're writing books, you would look at the reviews of the books, which is rather different than the citations. Impact factors in the H-index are really problematic. I mean, they don't represent the full body of scholarship, but the model scholarly communication here presumes that everything communicates culminates in that object. So if you give credit for the journal article, you're giving credit for everything else. And we have lots of pushback and plenty of pushback around the research excellence framework right now for that. So now we're moving into a phase where we've broken this up And all these different pieces create digital artifacts and throw them off. This is one from the sensor network and has like the field notes, the lab notes, the raw data set, the process data set, the preprints, the final prints. So all of those things we might preserve, we might give credit for all of those if somebody reuses them, but then do you give credit for the tweets? If your article gets tweeted, do you get extra brownie points for that? Some people will give them to you. And if it gets retweeted, you get extra points. You get gold stars for being retweeted. What about blog mentions? Okay, that's one that people would like to give credit for. Certainly for citations to your data, citations to your code, all these different pieces. So, you know, how do you give credit for people that really want to do new kinds of work? Who's come across Kathleen Fitzpatrick's work on planned obsolescence? Couple. Again, the back row is the one that's paying attention to these things. Okay. All right. Kathleen Fitzpatrick started writing a book about the changing nature scholarship. She's an English literature professor, and she wrote it completely online in the open on a blog, marked up paragraph by paragraph, and invited people to comment on it for a year or two as she was writing on it. And thousands of people did. She developed a whole community around the process of writing completely in the open. And then she was still able to publish a book, $79 cloth, mind you, that's winning awards. Okay. So, you know, so she's working in the open. How do you, and she's having great impact doing so, but how do you give her credit for this compared to the person who's done it differently? So you laugh about the tweets, but there's a whole altmetrics manifesto, and there's a company called Altmetrics, there's a site called altmetrics.org, and there's a number of projects working on new tools and new ways to evaluate scholarship. So you build different kinds of metrics and you give people credit for all of these things. And tweets and retweets are part of the credit in these systems. But we do not begin to have a theory of scholarly communication that says, does 2 tweets count for 1 download? Okay. Or, you know, how many downloads counts for a citation to a journal article? But we can also use these things to reconstruct the flow, and we can use them as a way to get into the system. So if you can find somebody's talk, maybe you can use that to find the journal articles. Or maybe you can use it to find the grant proposal and put the pieces back together again. Okay. Third thing is about how data practices really are local and not very generic. The long tail slide, you're probably bored with by now. But here's the idea that we've got some people in areas, astronomy, genomics, parts of biosciences, where you've got tens of thousands of people who are working with terabytes, petabytes, exabytes of data, where most of scholarship is happening out here. That you've got people working in smaller groups, smaller collaborations, and they have much more complex kinds of data, and they don't have a community around them. Another way of thinking about the relationships is, this is a definition of big data that goes back to about 2001 and is very popular in the business world, where data could be big by any of these different characteristics. So astronomy data are certainly big in volume. The sensor network data we've been looking at are big in variety. They're very complex. They're not big in number, but it's hard to handle them because sort of no two data sets are alike. And the Twitter feed data is very high in, it may be well structured, but it's very high in velocity. So the way you're going to handle these is going to be different depending on what kind of bigness you're talking about. Okay. But the fundamental problem still is what our data varies so much from one field to the next. So this cute little mouse is of interest in some parts of this room, and Marie Curie's notebook will be of interest to some other parts of the room, NASA as well. this ethnography sets of observations, these will never be reproduced. You know, these are one-time, be out in the field, observe what's going on. The climate data in the middle have now been standardized into forms where people can agree on them, they can build climate models. But this took 100 years of observing the climate before that data got sufficiently structured that you could bring it together. Agreements on things like average daily temperature turned out to be very difficult. There were dozens of different ways that average daily temperature was being computed, and that made it very difficult to make trustworthy models. There's still very big gaps in these models. You know, and some work well for clouds, some work well for wind, and various other things. But it's this great difference from field to field and project to project that makes it hard to have general approaches. This is a gross overgeneralization of ways to think about data in different fields, but it's one that I hope is helpful. Is you've got these sort of industrial methods, and we first came across this in astronomy at one of the NASA data archives. Say we do industrial astronomy. Okay? And that's literally the way they think about it, is it's big engineering. You know, we clean the data, we do the pipelines, we make it available for everybody else to use. Where more in the humanities, you're going to get this much more handcrafted artisanal methods. So, you know, the fact that you know how to sit down and work with these rare manuscripts and get some meaning out of them, it takes years, decades to develop that expertise. And there's very strong expertise on this side of the room in those kinds of artisanal methods. Okay. So when you think about, you know, what data means in astronomy, you would get things like, you know, charts and graphs like this. This is a 2009 article from Alyssa Goodman and her team at Harvard. They chose to use the 4-page format in Nature, the letter structure, which you were asking if this is a major source. This is a major source. This is what they chose to launch their 3D PDF. Okay. And so when this was published, you could rotate those figures inside the Nature article and look at them in different ways. So that's some of what data would look like, particularly in this area of this around star formation, as you can see. Okay. We spent 10 years with the Center for Embedded Network Sensing, with biologists, seismologists, engineers, electrical engineers, roboticists, computer scientists, looking at different ways to get data from all these different technologies in the field. And each of the different groups had different things that meant data to them. And this is just one example. This is where two rivers come together near Yosemite. One's coming out of the clean mountain water, one's coming out of the agricultural fields. You can see the mixing of the clean and dirty right in the middle. The kayak down the center has graduate students in it, of course, who are dropping sensors down and trying to measure the depth and measure what's happening underneath with nitrates and so on. And more graduate students and postdocs over here, okay? And cables strung across, and so robots and other cool things. So they get things like this, what's the velocity distribution? They end up doing some very interesting physics as well as the biology and the engineering out of it, and looking at how the nitrates were distributed in a much different way than their theories had predicted, because of sort of what was eating what on what side of the river. Okay. Looks a lot different, the astronomy data. If you are doing social surveys, you would need to know how to code things. This is from the General Social Survey. It's actually from a tutorial about how to code social surveys, and what does each punch mean across each year, and what are the frequencies, and what are the different parts of it, and then how can you run the statistics and deal with the missing data here. But if you can't run a survey and you want to do Twitter, you can use the API, the Application Programmer Interface. You can take it right off the feed. And this 416-page book from O'Reilly will help you learn how to do that. So again, considerable amount of skills involved, even in knowing how to get the data and what to do with them once you've got them. Back to Stefano and his lovely bricks. This is certainly a source of data. It's a physical artifact, but the carving in there, what was done, how it's interpreted, how it was translated over centuries is part of what he is looking at. And among our many fascinating conversations is the way that he uses C beta. And this is, 130 volumes or so of, even more. A massive collection, and of the Chinese Buddhist canon. So you don't need an English interface, because if you can't read Chinese, you shouldn't ought to be here anyway. But this is both his telescope, as he puts it, in that you can see further. You can mine and compare across this massive canon, where in his early days he had to go through those physical paper volumes to be able to look at the standard structure. But it's also a microscope in that you can look much more deeply, and you can compare images as well as text. And there's a whole community built up around this. And there's an Android app. There's probably an iPhone app as well that you can use to run this thing. And what does he do with it? Well, he builds things like this, okay, which he can explain. We give him a glass of wine later, okay, where he's comparing different kinds of translations and looking at how, what was known by whom at what time, and pulling together different kinds of texts. And now he can do this in a structured way such that these could be reused by other people as well. I mean, this is a critical edition, which again is a major resource that he's produced for other scholars to use. So now to go into the fourth and final of the four different trends is that my claim that this is not just a simple transition from the way we've been doing scholarship. It's a fairly fundamental paradigm shift. Again, from Alyssa Goodman, who teaches astronomy but also data visualization at Harvard, and she's got our beautiful Vermeer astronomer in the middle as our icon, to show that the scholar is equally balanced by the literature on which you draw, as well as the data and the tools on which you draw. You need all of those, but this is the part that's been conducted in the open. The far part is what was functioned much more privately. I think this is probably one of the strongest differences that we're seeing is people are conducting their research with the intent of writing a publication. Conducting your research with the expectation that you're producing data that will be reusable by others is a different way of doing the research. Now, you need to begin to document things and document detail for people that you may never meet. Although we certainly are finding in areas that don't have data repositories, when data do get shared, they're shared privately. So somebody sees something, here's a paper, maybe we could work together, and the person who produced the data is going to sit down with this trusted colleague and spend time helping explain it to them. So sometimes it still remains a personal communication. But this is a different way than most of us are doing our work. So again, to extend my overgeneralized metaphor, is people who are functioning at this more industrial end are concerned with things like replication. They do think that somebody else may go back and check and try to see if they can work out the numbers again, work out the lab routines again, or do something similar. In fact, it's stronger if you can ask the same question, use similar methods, and get the same result than absolute straight reproducibility. Whereas down here, and certainly the kind of things that you're doing with C beta are much more artisanal methods. The concern is no one's ever going to replicate it. Once it's been done, heaven forbid somebody should spend the years it takes to do that again. It is, it's much more about interpretation. But there's reasons to go back and inspect the interpretation. That's much more what peer review is doing in this environment, is looking at the validity, the trust of the interpretation. So the ways you would do this are considerably different. we need to be thinking about, if we really are going to make the data reusable, it's reusable by whom and over what time period. If you're building, if you know you're building a longitudinal study, if you're going to do a series of work that you think you're going to use the methods again, you're going to document your flows in sufficient detail that you can use them next year. We continually hear the concerns that the methods and the expertise left with each graduation, with each set of postdocs. Was this Mary's generation, John's generation, Alex's generation? Who do I have to find to go back and make sense out of those data? And this is perpetual to get back to it. So, how far out do you want to go, and are we thinking about reuse over long periods of time? At this meeting I was at early in May at a Radcliffe seminar at Harvard, someone pointed out that we still have Galileo's notebooks, and we still have Leonardo's notebooks as well. And the fact that we can go back to the data of Galileo and Leonardo is partly why they continue to be so valuable, and people continue to revisit that work. And so they said, can we promote this by saying, you will never be the next Galileo if you don't share your data? Do you want people to be able to go back and inspect and make sense of your work later? This is the draft outcome from that workshop. We decided that rather than writing one more long white paper, we would write a 10 simple rules paper for the PLOS biology. And these are the rules. Now, we're still arguing about them. There's a phone call scheduled in the next few days. Actually, not a phone call, a Google Hangout that's scheduled for the next few days. Obviously, that would be the way we would do this. And this was what a group of astronomers, statisticians, computer scientists, high-energy physicists, a couple information scientists, an archivist came up with, is to start with the principle of, if you assume good science requires good data, then make it inspectable and conduct your science with provenance in mind. How many of you know what provenance means? It's sort of scattered around the room. Okay. The people in the humanities understand provenance very, very deeply. There's much more, because provenance, where did something come from? What was the chain of custody? What came before? What do I need to know about it to trust it? So this is something that's actually carrying over from a humanistic tradition into a scientific tradition. So things are going in both directions as far as what should this chain be. But others of these these things make more sense in the hard physical sciences and life sciences than they do in most of the social sciences or the humanities. Another issue here is the amount of investment, particularly the amount of public investment that is made. This is but one of the NASA data archives. The European Space Agency has them. There's others around the world. For the Infrared Processing and Analysis Center, how many people do you think they are employed? How many people think 10 or less? 50 or less? 100 or less? 200 or less? Okay. 180 people. And they've been there for 30 years, since 1983. Taking data from these satellites, curating it, keeping it available for the long term. This is a very expensive process of infrastructure to do well, but it's one that works. People use those data, they trust them, they go back to them, and some of those 180 people are basically librarians and archivists. If you want to know how to make sense of data, there's someone there who can tell you, who can walk you through it, who can help you make those data usable. And you will contribute your data to places like this, and you will take data from places like this because you trust that it's going to be there for the long term. Whereas in other fields, in the social sciences and the humanities, projects are more being built on 2, 3, 4, 5-year grants. And I think this is a real challenge where you try to build a community, but you don't have a long enough term to sustain them, that people are going to trust them and invest the effort to build their research on top of them. Clarin is one on Language resources, common language resource and technology infrastructure, a big EU project. Large, growing, it's an exemplar of one of the well-run and broad buy-in projects to try to do something like the sciences, but they have a new director for user involvement, and they're really investing at getting this going. Claros here at Oxford has just got off the ground in 2011, extension from the Beasley Archive. Fabulous collection materials from multiple universities or multiple museums, and it also has a good ontology behind it. But so far, we're not finding scholarly papers that refer to this. Now, is it just not long enough? It's only been a couple years since it's out. Lots of hits, but again, the credit question. Are hits enough to tell your funders people are really using it? There's a real chicken and egg problem of getting the sustainability here to get people to trust and invest. The late lamented Arts and Humanities Data Service. This is one that the UK government invested in starting, at least 10 years ago, and it was really heralded as a very important investment for the arts and humanities. Finally, this community was going to get great resources, well-curated resources, and what you can't read here is as of April 2008, this will no longer be supported as a national service. This was very big news around the world when the AHDS went down, because you'd finally build a community around it, and then what does the trust in this mean to sustain this community? And so finding ways to have long-term investment, sustain communities, I think is one of the biggest challenges we have here. Okay, so there's also a supply and demand problem, and this is your classic supply and demand of finding what the right market price is, but it's not actually very useful for this particular argument. And I sort of cleared this with David Vines at lunch today to get a sense of a better way to explain it. Where the supply issue is the continuity and the trust. People know those NASA archives are going to be there. They trust them, and they trust the continuity, and you get a community around it. Where you don't have the same kind of investment in the arts and humanities, at least so far for most of them. So the demand side is we're not always seeing as much reuse. And I think it's particularly with investigator work in the sciences, the social sciences. So when the RCUK says you will share your data, who's going to use it again? Who's going to go and try to get your data from you? How often is that going to happen? We have a paper coming out any day now in PLOS One about the 10-year study of SENS, looking at who shared what, when, with whom. And we found that relatively little of their data ever were asked for, and rarely did they go and ask anybody else for data. It was much too hard to use somebody else's data. And these are among the reasons for it, is you've got to be able to identify it, you've got to retrieve it, you've got to have the right software to open it, you've got to be able to be able to interpret what you've got, evaluate it, compute upon it, and all these other things to know whether you can trust this and what the provenance is behind it. This is a project that I'm part of, and the incentive here is sort of a working assumption from the International CODATA and the International Council on Scientific and Technical Information, that if we find a better way to cite data, if people get citations for data, then they're more likely to release their data. But is that enough incentive for people to deal with the large number of issues that they have to use other data? And that's the variance. So you've got fields where they've worked it out, and other fields where they're a long way from working this out. So what we really need to think about as a community is the investments in the infrastructure. How much of it is in the data archives? Is it the tools, the services, and the support to make these useful? A workforce. One of the things I went to here was a workforce all-day symposium run by JISC saying that much of research requires postdocs, software engineers, data archivists, kinds of activities that simply don't get rewarded. And when those people graduate, when those postdocs finish, they're gone. And there's not a good way to promote them. There's not a good way to keep that expertise. We need a new kind of career path for people who are going to help move the next generation of scholarship along. A number of data science programs are growing around the country and around the world on data management training, because people don't learn in graduate school how to manage data. Things like metadata, things like provenance simply aren't part of the curriculum. But let's face it, people who are good at asking research questions and clever at finding answers are not necessarily good at metadata and provenance. And they don't necessarily care to be good at metadata and provenance either. So it's, how much of this do you want to load on the researcher, and how much of it do you want to put somewhere else in the workforce? And we haven't figured that out yet. So there's a lot of alignment of incentives that need to be done here. The universities aren't giving much credit for people to use new kinds of tools and services, or much credit for releasing their data. So there's going to be a lot of different kinds of mindsets are involved in making these things useful. So let me wrap up with that. And these are the 4 points, is that open scholarship is the norm, has been the norm for several centuries, conceivably will continue to be the norm, but it's being enacted in very different ways, and in different fields. As more scholarship is conducted online in the open, and we've got this convergence, we have opportunities to take advantage of new resources, build new communities, ask new questions, make new arguments we didn't before, but we've got a lot of risks as well. The practices are local. People are finding a way to optimize very differently depending on their particular style of research and their ways of doing their business. But we do have a pretty fundamental paradigm shift happening here. I think that the degree of the paradigm shift is not being recognized in these policies that are coming down from the funding agencies. They're saying, well, we gave you money to do the research, putting your data out is part of that same grant. And that really is a different set of activities, and it's something that very few people really have the capacity to do. But until we think these things through, this is going to determine what's going to be in the Bodleian Library for the next generation of scholars to be able to use. So we're back to dealing with all of these different layers of communication at once, and that will keep us busy for some time. Thank you.
I keep a close watch on this heart of mine.